with the idea that maybe sometime in the future you would start paying rent, but they didn't seem to care too much as long as they could put bodies in those buildings. Houston has since created a kind of stir in the Middle East in order to somehow get back on the road. Peter's architecture is very involved in this. No, it's not. Peter, I had no program and no site for my students, and so they wandered around for 8 weeks doing strange things. Peter had a very real site. It was like one of the sites that I was asking my students to find, but he had found it already. And he also had a program, but the program, as I remember, came from his imagination. It was a kind of story that he told, which he will do again tonight. I was impressed by his activity and the activity of his students. We since have become friends and this semester colleagues in the second-year graduate studio. Peter, though is not a Texas kind of guy, is really a Princeton kind of guy. It took him, how long did this take, Peter? It took him 20 years to get out of that situation. In the early days, as an undergraduate and graduate at Princeton, he had a whole array of people wandering around. Graves, Eisenman, Meyer are all first beginning to teach, and they're teaching there. Peter is one of their star students. At that time, Graves is helping Eisenman make buildings that don't get built, but by drawing the elevations. Eisenman would call up Graves and say, "Michael, I've got to that point where I've got to do the elevation. I don't know how to do that. Could you come and draw the elevation?" And Michael would do that. It still seems to be the case. Again, Peter became a kind of, I think, stood out in that circumstance, and probably is thankful to have such extraordinary teachers, young and vibrant at that time. Worked for Michael during his, as Peter says, his Cubist years, and did that interesting experimental work. I think Peter's exit from Princeton came after Michael's foray back to Rome, where Michael, why am I doing this to Michael? Where Michael made sketches not from real buildings, but from drawings of buildings. It was peculiar, but a version of postmodern architecture came forth after that. That was, I think, when Peter said enough is enough, and he exited to as a kind of for a respite to Cincinnati, and then for a short time teaching there. Peter was also teaching at Princeton during the time of his working, I would say, with Michael, and then moved 10 years ago to Rice, is one of the most extraordinary teachers there, but also has been involved in a number of buildings. Let me say that during a certain period at Princeton, Peter was doing buildings on his own, about 22 residences so he gets under his belt. The various PA Design Awards, et cetera, but Peter and I both are refusing to talk about PA Design Awards this year. The fundamental explorations of meaning lie at the core, these are not my words, but Peter Papadimitriou, lie at the core of Peter Waldman's work, most important of which is the dialectic presentation of opposites, dualities, and inversions. These investigations often involve juxtaposed scales, yet maintain concurrent readings through the conscious transformation of elemental building parts. They are also linked to a phenomenological sense through passage and sequence. And let me add that besides being an extraordinary colleague, Peter builds ideas, but probably first and foremost, Peter makes buildings. Peter Waldman.
Good. Wonderful. Let's, Emilio, let's get rid of these lights. No. Good. I don't know what's in here, a check or something. Is this, okay. Wonderful. I'm delighted to be here, and I was delighted last January to be invited out for thesis reviews to a school where I knew some of the people and had heard all the legends of the place, and was extraordinarily impressed with your thesis process and the nature of the problems and the discussion. So when Robert came back later on and asked if I might have an extended kind of visit here, I naturally said yes, which is what I tend to do all the time, even though it's slightly crazy. I intend, instead of flying in on a Wednesday and leaving on a Thursday night or a Friday morning, sometime to stay here long enough to see a bit of this state and all that's around. When I was also asked to speak as part of this lecture series on cultural interventions, I believe it's called, I thought I was out of my league, because what I appreciate what Robert says is that I, besides a lot of teaching, I try to build buildings. This is a recent phenomenon for me. I've had buildings that happen to have been built on my own since 1973. I was never really taught very much about building buildings when I was in school. I was taught how to form them. And so I had 22, 28 residential additions that happened to be constructed somehow from 1973 to 1980. I then went to Texas to supposedly work on larger scale buildings, which I had the opportunity at the time. Very, very few got built. It was a sort of 10-year period in my life where I felt that I was indeed perceiving myself as just dealing with the poetics of ideas and not necessarily with building. At some point, though, in 1988, I got a phone call from Princeton from somebody who had seen a number of my projects there, had tried to bid on it, and when they came up for sale, which is not very often, and I don't recommend them for the resale market, but in any event, thought that I was probably too busy to work on her home, but if I did have time, maybe I'd meet with them. And I happened to be giving a lecture at MIT that next week, so I said, of course, I come up every month to the Northeast, which was a lie. But I said, I'll be in the area and I will drop in. I'll see you. And I dropped in on a Saturday, spoke to Dr. and Mrs. Fine, who had, this is a project I'll be showing you, a wonderful site and a wonderful agenda. And in any event, the design went well for a year, and it's been under construction now for a year, and it's just about done. I'll show you that. But a few months later, I also was asked to do another large house in Houston. Those are the two major projects I'd like to show you today. It's sort of work that I'm, for better or worse, shows that I have not built very much in 10 years, from a period of time that I built 3 or 4 projects a year or so. It is actually full of stuff. But for a change, having not had my projects built, I've been thinking about how to build them, how to conceive them, how to literally conceive of a project from building them up from foundations through framing to waterproofing, etc. And so what I'll be showing you are a series of models and then a series of construction shots. Can you hear me, by the way? A series of construction shots that actually, as the building is built, so it's conceived and so it's occupied and used. Okay. What have I done? Wonderful. The lights out. Just okay. I can do this without it, but it'll be helpful if I. Yeah, I'd like to read a couple of things. I don't know if the bulb burnt or the. Yeah. There's a plug here. Okay, we can start too while we play with this. I would like to read a couple of things though. I'd like to tell you a bit about the structure of the talk, broken down into threes. It's going to start with a map, it's going to end with 3 map makers. I start with a map because having moved around a bit, I always like to know where I am. I think that's the most important thing for me in terms of architecture, is orientation. And I do it by very simple means. I know every morning that the sun rises in the east and it usually sets in the west. And if I'm above the equator, then the sun is in the south. It sets at high noon. I have spent some time below the equator, though, and it's wonderful to think that the sun comes from the north. But I stress the word orientation and mapping and knowing where one might be, and that's why I consider the issue of foundation making to be extremely important.
There's a flashlight.
Oh, okay. I'll use a
help
flashlight
for now.
instead. Good. Okay. Also, I guess I can use this as a pointer, but I'm told not to move very much. Okay. I will... Good. This is like Halloween. This is great. Thank you, Emilio. Okay. I'm set. A flashlight and a stick. Okay. My work will not enter into, I think, strongly philosophical terms. It will try to deal with the facts of what I think are architectural culture rather than philosophical culture, etc. And I'd like to talk about those people who build, okay? They might be called, I give them names, I give many things names. They might be called surveyors, they might be called nomads, they might even be called lunatics. These issues come up again and again. I use them because I find that in our culture, the New World culture, etc., that we tend to relocate ourselves very often. It happens to be a condition of being New World Americans. People move around a bit. When you move around, you don't necessarily always move on to new territory. Sometimes you pass by territory you've been before and you see marks of things that you've left. So I think the nomadic is one dimension. I think we very often try to measure where we are, and that's the surveyor point. And I think that there is this particular dimension in our lives which have to do in architecture with not only from sunrise to sunset, but the sort of dark side of things, nighttime, the other 12 hours. And that's what I call the dimension of the lunatic. I find that probably in my mind it's been helpful for me, and perhaps neglected in a way, to take measuring seriously, surveying, to take the idea that one moves and has to reorient oneself, and actually to design buildings for their occupation at night as well as the day. So that's where they come up. But I also give other people who build names. They're not my own. They've been called masons. They have to do with stereometric, obviously, solid stuff. They have to do with framers, whether it be wood or with steel. And then there are the mechanics that are pretty remarkable. They might, these 6 names of people, break down to groups of scientists who deal with facts and magicians who deal with fictions. But I actually think magicians are really very good scientists who just move very, very quickly. Okay. I also have been, those 22 or 28 projects, plus the 2 that I will show you now, have been dealing with designing homes and constructing homes for people who are basically homeless. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean the charity dimension, or those people who do not have it. Those are people who happen to be homeless but who pay mortgages. I find because many of my clients have come from someplace else, are leaving a mark on a house in a territory, and will probably not drop dead there, but will be moving on. So it's for a temporal period of time. And I think that the issue of homelessness and building housing for the bourgeoisie are about the same in some ways. Because what happens, whether you have a big moving truck or a small valise or a little bundle of something, is that you pack yourself up, your little local pieces, whether they be washers and dryers or just a few books or a shirt, and you take that which you have from one place to another. So to boil down to what my architecture has become in recent years is designing a number of what I call warehouses or stables with packing crates in it, spatial making devices that contain you, contain that which you have, but indeed you might be able to pack up and move on. Okay, now this talk might have other titles, okay, if you consider surveyors, nomads, and lunatics as a kind of cultural condition. Okay, it's an attempt to establish some ground rules for myself. I teach a course at Rice called Specifications for Construction. It follows exactly the same set that we incorporate in with our general conditions for the contract, from descriptions of the site through foundations, etc., through there. But it takes each one as having a potential architecture on its own, independent in its own way. It's based on a way that you can go step by step through a process and establish some rules that are recurrent, that have happened for the past 5,000 years, that are maybe go beyond issues of style. Okay, as a bottom line, given how people talk about our cultural conditions, I think I'm really way out of whack with most of them who moan and groan about where the world is right now and how dislocated everything might be. I actually think that the sun still comes up in the same way it's been coming up for a long time, and that gravity still exists. And so I think there's plenty of ground rules between those two things to make an architecture. What I'd like to do, and so you'll know when to back onto this, but I think we'll take about an hour and 15 minutes altogether, is survey very briefly some issues that I've touched upon, and then survey some projects that I've developed from 1973 to 1988 very quickly to show where one might have gone from an architecture that was not concerned with being built but was built to an architecture that was concerned with specifically its step-by-step construction. Okay, and during the last 4 years of that time, of that survey, from 1984 to 1988, Christopher Gennick and I worked on a number of projects, developing what we had termed spatial tales of origin. They're very much having to do with notions of construction, notions that perhaps one needs to establish the context first within which one can build anything. And we did, which is the first time I ever did it, a number of competitions on the urban scale, which I'll show briefly, at the building scale and at the room scale. But the major body of the talk will be on two constructions, what I had mentioned, one warehouse and one stable. The warehouse is in Princeton, the stable is in Houston, okay. The warehouse happens to be a residence. It's filled with packing crates for acquisitive people. And the stable happens to be a kind of home for two psychiatrists. It is a stable for the Trojan Horse and a Stegosaurus, and I'll go into that. But let me begin with this map, and I should remind you at the end that I'd like to make a remark about three map makers. One is Marat of the French Revolution, who I think is a surveyor. One is Raphael, who I consider a nomad, and Narcissus, who I think is the lunatic. These titles come up as being very, very useful for me. I also will be dealing, though I write narratives of specifications for construction of my stuff all the time, I won't be going into that. You can see that in other sources. But I will read very brief stories, since Robert initiated the question of the Middle East. One story is by a fellow named William Saroyan, Armenian, writer of Armenian descent, okay, called The Human Comedy. One by Walter Lippmann. Saroyan's is from 1943, which is the year of my birth, so it must be a good year. Walter Lippmann's from 1927, which is called A Preface to Morals, and the last one is Carlo Levi, about his experience during World War II in a place called Eboli. Christ stopped in Eboli. They become prefaces, substitute texts, I think, for some of the work I'll show you. Now, the reason why I show you this map is that I grew up, if I could say it, I used to say grow up, or I spent the first 18 years of my life on the East Coast, and I'm told not to go away from the microphone. That's my Halloween act. I grew up oriented to the Atlantic, okay, for 18 years. I went to school about an inch down in central New Jersey, still basically oriented there. I then stayed on a straight line in 1967, went into the Peace Corps in Peru, and out of people Peru here, and woke up every morning, not to see the sun actually shining on the volcanoes here, but actually my reference was to the afternoon to the Pacific Ocean on the side. So that's a very important line to me right good here. And the sun came up at high noon in the north here, and over here it comes to the Waldman to the south. I now live here, which in some ways is a smaller world, not quite halfway between here and here, facing east once again on this kind of middle body of water. And that's where I locate myself. say east. I was always oriented, and I to disorient myself here. And I find it curious to be at this point again, much farther west than where I had been at that point. I should point out also that Christopher Columbus did something really curious. He went all this distance west to find the east. I never understood that. He went as far as you could to find China. Well, about in that line, if you go about as far east in the Western world as one can, one hits Armenia. Armenia, I think, is a very important place because for me, between Columbus, between Genoa and Spain, right through there, actually was in the middle of a world where America was one myth on one side and Armenia is becoming a myth on the other side for me, through here. Okay. And I've got an Armenian story to tell which is related to that. But before I do, I'd like to cover some ground. I like rumors. Okay, I find that they're useful. It's rumored by some that I'm only interested in what some call the other, in quotes, as a cultural condition, as an architectural condition, the issue of inversions. If a roof is like a pediment, I always seem to turn it upside down. Okay. The other may be what's considered the elusive culture of America in the New World. I'm very, very much concerned with the promise of the New World and what that can do for one's imagination. It's rumored also by others, though, that I begin each project and each pedagogic exercise with prehistorical conditions for orientation and construction, very ancient techniques. And so I'm caught between the two. Frankly, I'm interested in both, and I'm interested in architecture of conjunction. And as much as I am fascinated with the new and with America over there, I'm beginning to be fascinated with Armenia and about going as far east as one can and still be in the Western world. Okay. Now, speaking of Armenia, which might sound like a side thing, I found this book a couple of years ago, and it's extremely helpful, hopefully. Also, it's set in California, and that's where I am right now, so I have to orient myself. It's by William Saroyan. It's called The Human Comedy. Chapter 1 is called Ulysses. And this goes on for a couple of pages, but I think we'll make it fast. The little boy named Ulysses Macaulay one day stood over the new gopher hole in the backyard of his house on Santa Clara Avenue in Ithaca, California. The gopher of this hole pushed up fresh, moist dirt and peeked out at the boy, who was certainly a stranger, but perhaps not an enemy. Before this miracle had been fully enjoyed by the boy, one of the birds, so the gopher's down there and the birds are up there, can't help but do that, of Ithaca flew into the old walnut tree in the front yard, not the backyard, and after settling itself on a branch, broke into a rapture, moving the boy's fascination from the earth to the tree, from the backyard to the front yard. Next, best of all, a freight train puffed and roared far away. The boy listened and felt the earth beneath him tremble with the moving of the train. Then he broke into running, moving, it seemed to him, swifter than any life in the world. When he reached the crossing, he was just in time to see the passing of the whole train from locomotive to caboose. He waved to the engineer, but the engineer did not wave back to him. He waved to 5 others who were with the train, but not one of them waved back. They might have done so, but they didn't. At last, a Negro appeared leaning over the side of a gondola. Above the clatter of the train, Ulysses heard the man singing, which I won't, "Weep no more, my lady, or weep no more today. We will sing one song for the old Kentucky home, far away." Ulysses waved to the Negro too, and then a wonderful and unexpected thing happened. This man, black and different from all the others, waved back to Ulysses, shouting, "Going home, boy, going back where I belong." The small boy and the Negro waved to one another until the train was almost out of sight. Then Ulysses looked around. There it was all around him, funny and lonely, the world of his life, the strange, weed-infested, junky, wonderful, senseless, yet beautiful world. Walking down the track came an old man with a rolled bundle on his back. Ulysses waved to this man too, but the man was too old and too tired to be pleased with the small boy's friendliness. The old man glanced at Ulysses as if both he and the boy were already dead. The little boy turned slowly and started for home. As he moved, he still listened to the passing of the train, the singing of the Negro, and the joyous words, "Going home, boy, going back where I belong." He stopped to think of all this, loitering beside a china bowl tree and kicking at the yellow smelly fallen fruit of it. After a moment, he smiled the smile of the Macaulay people, the gentle, wise, secret smile which said yes to all things. When he turned the corner and saw the Macaulay house, Ulysses began to skip, kicking up a heel. He tripped and fell because of this merriment, but he got to his feet and went on. His mother was in the yard throwing feed to the chickens. She watched as the boy tripped and fell and got up and skipped again. He came quickly and quietly and stood beside her, then went to the hen nest to look for eggs. He found one. He looked at it a moment, picked it up, brought it to his mother, and very carefully handed it to her, by which he meant what no man can guess and no child can remember to tell. This kind of quote is full, besides being named Ulysses, etc., full of what I call recurrent dualities, back and front, up and down, gophers, strangers, old men, young men. It's how I structure my teaching, how I structure, I guess, my buildings. Now we're going to start rolling away. This is a painting by Grant Wood. It's called Reverend Weems Tells the Story, tells the fable of George Washington cutting down a cherry tree. It's part of my fascination with the New World. George Washington, when he was a little boy, must have been very mature. He looked pretty old. Okay? He lived in a Georgian house. It's a strange thing for the father of a New World country. And he lived around old world landscapes. Now, he was very wise at that stage, and he cut down these models of old world landscapes. I would hope that in the darkening clouds and beyond these trimmed trees, he would find a wilderness. But I think it's extremely important that he not only started with cutting down a tree so neatly trimmed and imported from some other place, but I hope he would burn that house down at the same time. Okay. This is another American condition. Yeah. This is the other American condition besides George Washington, in that it's the Native American. I show it because some of their architecture sat tentatively on the ground. They had a different attitude about who could own and what you could do to territories and landscapes. And I'm particularly intrigued with this Indian chief who happens to have feathers in his hair, which makes him bird-like, as well as claws around his neck, which I assume came from a bear that scratched the ground. It's that dimension that's interesting. When I went to Arequipa, Peru, in the Peace Corps from 67 to 69, I was surrounded by 3 live volcanoes. It was made out of pumice stone, the dried lava, and it was between the 3 volcanoes sat 2 glacial rivers were formed, and that's how the entire valley was irrigated. It was quite a beautiful place. Looked like Shangri-La. It was fantastic. The most interesting thing about that territory, though, is people built literally out of that which came out of the ground. It had a material called CR, S-I-L-L-A-R, and it was like pumice stone, very light. They cut it into blocks, a half a meter by 50 centimeters by 25 centimeters by 40 centimeters. The curious block size, very useful, big enough so you could lift and get out, and they made everything out of that one material. And I always thought that as they incrementally took down the volcanoes, they built what they call this white city. That was an important part of my life. I must admit, when I was in school, I learned all about transparencies and thinness, and the more a building looked like a cardboard model at the time, the better it was. It was called abstract. I had 2 years of an architecture that had some weight and substance. Another thing that I'm interested in terms of the New World, is starting again and seeing, whether it be 5,000 years old or not, spatial tales of origins or Genesis stories as being extremely useful. Whether they start with a condition where there was the heavens and the waters and there was a kind of architectural condition horizontally between the two, and then there was day and night, and then there was land and water, and then land had certain qualities, etc. These step-by-step building up over 6 days of Genesis, extremely important process of understanding where we are. Okay, this theme has been touched upon throughout time, except I'll point it out in some New World preoccupations. Thomas Cole did a series of paintings called The Course of the Empire, where he took a real setting in the Hudson River Valley, a mountain, a body of water, a kind of landscape through there, and he gave them names. This one is the Savage State. It's where architecture is only tentative. There's an Indian set of teepees over here. People are hunters. They run around. They don't settle permanently in a territory. They go on the next one, which is the Pastoral Setting. The same mountain is still there, and there is a kind of a stone hedge, or somewhat of a stone, but still rather small setting at that one point. These paintings were painted between 1833 and 1836. The same mountain is there, the same conditions. The water is now being made placid and pacific. In fact, there's hardly any natural condition at all except planted terraces, perhaps, over there. And there's architecture everywhere. And then the city self-destructs in what's called destruction, okay? But the mountain is still there. The water is becoming tumultuous. And the final one is called desolation. And I like to think that this isn't the sun at all, but it's really the moon. But nature's growing back. The mountain is still there. There's another condition. There's talking about, as Pellegrino di Cerno talked about last week, issues of laws of nature and laws of man. There is, in the necessity of building cities, always the confrontation in the New World with the wilderness, with making artifacts and having the wilderness somewhat accessible at the same time. It makes me think that building in this place requires a precondition for the landscape, for the garden, and for wilderness. Now, all these themes have come together not only in this continent, in this hemisphere, but actually, obviously, in many, many places. In Cheneseau, there were a series of constructions and series of reciprocal landscape conditions. It started with the wilderness, and somebody, after the first millennium, decided to build a castle keep in a protected little square piece without a blade of grass there. It was a kind of protected condition against the wilderness. Things went on, warfare changed, etc., and then one built this little piece over here and built that reciprocal garden cut out of the wilderness. This is still in a protected condition, accessible by a bridge and by the water. Well, things got very successful and very comfortable, and now the very thing that separated the body, that separated and gave safety, meaning the water, became bridged by this long piece through there, and so other territories came along. It's these reciprocal building of landscapes and building of buildings that build up a life to the site that interests me. I guess I've been a bit influenced, among others, by Lars Lerup's book and thinking in terms of building the unfinished. So many of my projects are deliberately left unfinished, anticipating a next step. I guess they can get occupancy permits at times, though, can't they? This is from Rem Koolhaas's book on Delirious New York, which I'm sure you know. What intrigues me is the site of the Empire State Building at 34th Street and 5th Avenue. Used to be in 1799 a farm. People lived beneath the trees, worked the ground, and lived and worked in one spot. John Thompson's sons got fat and sassy and built townhouses where they worked someplace but lived in this site. They then sold off the property to a hotel where people neither lived nor worked but spent a surrogate amount of time in a kind of hotel. And then in 1930, the Empire State Building was built, which really had more to do with touching the sky than living beneath the trees, and far more to do with work than with living. It's the life of the Empire State Building, about its workplace, etc., about its dimension of its context, sky and ground, is extremely related, I think, in my mind, to knowing what happened there before. Okay. The last general issue, I think, is one of the, what I call syntax of structure of the megaron. The idea that how a building sits on the ground might indeed be different than how it meets the sky. That how you build a wall and make an opening in it with that triangulated weight going on down is very different than how you make a framed opening. And so this dialectic occurs, structural dialectic occurs in my work. In Assisi, one has a building well grounded to the medieval society down here. But you have an invention of another world which is up there. If this is done by scientists and masons alike who can measure stone and add it and know what gravity does, this is also done by a magician. It is weightless. It sits on its own set of new foundations, this kind of choir piece through there. And it's the coincidence of the two in one building that interests me. We can name these and we can count these bricks, and there's a lot in architecture that is conventional and codifiable and useful. They provide good foundations. But there's a lot in architecture that is difficult to name, okay? And one example of this is the very first image I saw when I was a student in 1961. We as a class were shown this, and our teacher, Billy Showman, said, that thing, piece of pyramid over there, is architecture. It is geometrical, it is measurable, it's abstract, it stands for not the natural condition, but mountains in this abstracted sand, etc. And at one point had been covered with polished, I think it's granite, so it would sparkle in the sun and be very different from the gray, the kind of sand that was around. And we all said yes, because it was knowable and measurable, and we all had isosceles triangles in high school. And no one asked what this thing was. But the same culture, in terms of cultural interventions, that made this and made that, also made this. And I think the Sphinx is as much about architecture as the pyramid is itself. And it's the two of them together, that which you can name and that which you can't name, which is of interest to me. The Sphinx is part pharaoh, part woman, part beast, etc. through there. It's very curious indeed. But it comes up again and again in architecture. When one studies the Acropolis, one studies the Parthenon and other things. But the Parthenon, you can count columns, you can count spaces, you can measure it and know it. And rarely do they talk about Athena's spear, which I think is a remarkable break of a woman's stick through that male-dominated building. But across the way is the Erechtheion, which is the strangest building I know, because it is set up with both a clear dialectic of the abstracted wall and the columns, which are freestanding over on that side, as well as pilasters. But then they have this strange set of columns made out of caryatids, holding up this other portion, sitting on its own kind of base, etc., through there. And so the Sphinx and the Erechtheion are two curiosities together with the known things of the pyramid and the Parthenon that intrigue me. Now, this will give you a hint, in case you leave early, of kinds of architectural issues that I've gone into in the last two places. This is what I call a packing crate. It happens to be for the moon. It happens to be for the dining room. It happens to be for wedding china and silver and crystal in the Fine House in Princeton, New Jersey. There are people with a number of possessions who wanted more space, okay? And their needs for the possessions and needs for light were so dominant and specific and something that they were so tied into from the day of their marriage, they made a series of packing crates that would be delivered to the site that would hold their lighting. In a dining room, it's artificial lighting, so it's a moon, okay, and hold all their other kinds of pieces. It's in a very, very simple building. This happens to be the back of one of the packing crates set in the warehouse. Okay, this happens to be the warehouse in the front and what I call a nomadic piece in the back. The warehouse is built by masons. The nomadic piece is built by framers. It's thinner. And the nomadic piece eventually enters, in the still of the night, the interiority of the warehouse and posits certain light conditions, etc. Okay. That's the nomadic piece that then appears at night and during the day and filters light in various ways, which I'll go into. But as a construction, it is made of packing crate material. It's made of joints that are all fold into various packing crates and get put up to qualify the light in this house, in this case the morning, the afternoon light, as the other one in the dining room qualified the other. This also has a Sphinx, okay? There's a view from the big box to a sunken master bedroom sequence, which is this piece. And there is this eye, and I call it a stegosaurus, a Sphinx, but it's an animistic piece. It looks beast-like to me. It's going to have a backbone that connects it to the pyramid, which is glowing back there. And so it makes a landscape of a pyramid and a Sphinx, an artificial landscape in a house that has a new artificial territory, etc. Now this is another project. This is what I call the stable for a Trojan horse. And it's really another house, a very anonymous kind of space, but it has one foreign thing pushed on through it. The foreign thing happens to be what I call a Trojan horse. Just like the Greeks built a magical piece to break down the walls of the conventions of Troy, so within a very conventional new development of Friendswood in Houston, Texas, which had strict architectural guidelines on what they called the 12 acceptable historical styles. Some clients asked if I could do this, and I said I wasn't taught that at school, but there's some schools you can go to learn that. And I said, I'll see what the conventions are. To make a long story short, I worked within certain conventions, but then I also found that there was territory beyond the exposed facades, that you could do anything you wished, and so which is what that is about. It also has a new surrogate garden made because it faced a golf course in a cul-de-sac, and everybody assumed the golf course was the only view of the world. In making the garden, I established a number of what I call in Spanish testigos, but in English it's witnesses, which I think is extremely important that one witnesses this Trojan horse marching through the space. That's the Trojan horse, whose rib cage is the study where the husband and wife get together on occasion, and there is a headpiece of it, which you'll see later. This is in construction. I'll show you more pictures later. But there's a landscape made out of a number of water gardens, which are mud at this point in this photograph, sitting on its own foundation, which is for Japanese fish called koi, which is the ugliest fish in the world. And the Trojan horse sits on that aqueous condition of these bulgy-eyed koi. So that's the start of the Trojan horse, which pushes through the conventions of another kind of house. Now, very quickly, I'll show you 15 years of architecture and about 3.5 projects. I started out thinking that architecture was dealing with the abstraction of one's world, okay? And I did a whole bunch of residential additions that were made out of cardboard, essentially. It was stucco over wood frame, okay? They dealt with transparencies. They didn't know how to meet the ground. I was never taught about that at school. It had no notion about how to meet the sky. I painted it blue. The sky was sort of a plane up there that was like all the other planes that flew around the place. There was one place, though, in this beginning project that was curious. I did this in '73, so the work may look like some other white architecture you know. When I got around to this other facade, I didn't know how to handle the existing bushes that never got trimmed. I didn't know how to handle this surface, which I knew in some ways was facing a side garden, was different from the other. So I made a wiggle saying, I don't know what to do. That wiggle's remained in my work. Now, I did a whole bunch of other things in between, and they all got finished. But I would take now and then pictures of it under construction. I don't know why. But years later, I would look back, and there was a curiosity about the measure of the nails for the drywall, about the scaffolding, about the framing that was left exposed, or then, if not marked by nails, marked by stripes, that seemed far more interesting to me than the finished product itself. And this is the last big addition. I showed you the first one that I did about 1979, 1980. It was a two-part project, but basically it was a house that had an entry here by the stairs, a dining room, a kitchen, a garage, a breezeway, a living room, and they wanted to add a new back of the house to open it up to the garden, basically to double the living room out here, to expand the kitchen, make it into a family room, to make a screen porch that would complement the parties in this den or the living room. And then they wanted a quick design, when I was finished with it, of the garden. Now, at the time, I just knew to do architecture. I didn't know I had to do the garden before I did architecture, so they said, come up with an idea for a garden. And I had an idea for a back facade, but no one ever taught me how to do a garden, so I said, well, if the facade is one edge of this garden, we'll just put its facade down on the ground. And that's what that space is, with the fireplace flue becoming a walkway, etc., through there. This is back in '79, '80, when everybody was trying to make facades out of their buildings, and I sensed this at Princeton, and I thought these people didn't need an edge of their space. They wanted to extend their house spatially into the garden, so this is like an extruded section. It's cut on off through there. I was beginning to learn how a building sits on the ground. I was beginning to learn how it might meet the sky. I was beginning to see that you could make some things out of white sticks and some things out of mud through there. Some things could have corners and some things could have corners going away. And even you could punch some windows into a thick wall as well as have budded glass corners. So I began to develop a kind of syntax or a language for myself. I also at the time got enthusiastic about bathroom tile and And the husband wanted a fireplace to knock the socks off of all his business partners, and the wife wanted a very modest one. And they had a modest budget. To make a long story short, I had good time with bathroom towel, and I thought at the time was about what I called appropriate elaboration against the kind of non-facadal nature of the house. A couple years later, they actually followed through, to my surprise, not on the garden, but on the master bedroom that was in the space between the two things which we had planned in there. So since I knew they were never going to build this garden out there, I decided to make a garden and to put ceramic tile up there to plant parterres up on its surface. Bless you. These then begin a series of models, which is still my obsession today. I had done one earlier, retirement house in the midst of all these residential additions. In 1978, Dr. and Mrs. Mayer, psychiatrist, also she was a botanist, he's a psychiatrist, bought 16 acres of woods in Princeton. I had been used to doing residential additions or subtractions or something like this. And he said, aren't these woods terrific? Where shall we put the house, Peter? And I had no notion, because no one ever taught me where to put a house in the middle of woods at Princeton. But I did remember reading Corbusier, and he said that primitive man makes a clearing in the woods. And so I said to Dr. and Mrs. Mayer, I have no notion where to put this house, because I can't tell where the sun is. It was filtering in through, and I said, surely you want to have sun coming in some rooms in the morning and the afternoon. I said, you'll never have direct light. We have to make a clearing. Also, the ground was wet. We knew we had to build up off the ground. And by making a clearing in the woods, I could then perhaps begin to orient the house. So I made a clearing, and I should have made the models with trees around it, but I didn't at the time because trees weren't architecture to me at the time. Okay, but I put down that which I did not know. Like, instead of putting down the pyramid first, I put down the Sphinx. I put down a nervous line at the back of the site to the western edge, because I said, my building's going to go this far, but I don't know what its shape is. But I said there's a kind of garden wall there, and they had an aviary desire for that, and other people preoccupied with fish ponds, etc. But I did the back first, and then I knew how to do the fronts because I was 1978, 79, and everybody entered right in the middle of things. So I set up this kind of courtyard gate with some steps in the front and some steps coming on through, and I said, okay, I have a front and a back and a parking area there. And then I set up the sides of this first space, which had to be a square for some reason, but the side walls did not touch the thicker front wall. They slipped by it, and they were thinner. And then I said, a house is coming soon. I knew a house was coming between the front and the back wall, but there were some preconditions to the house. It would be where Mrs. Mayer would have both a carport, but it was a translucent roof for growing plants, starting out plants, tomato plants, in March and April before you could put them in the ground in May. So it was like a greenhouse, which gathered water that emptied into the courtyard, and then the opposite kind of roof, a kind of psychiatric emergency place, where some of Dr. Mayer's patients would come, and he would speak to them and have a little courtyard of their own there. So there was one house for him and one for her. And then I said, well, a house can go in between. A house happened to go in between. It was a pretty simple house with a big door, because I didn't want people to miss how to get into this thing. It's my first big house in a kind of open piece, and I figured instead of being too complex, I'd just have one door and a few windows. Okay. And then it got built. And I said it got built, but it was not designed, and the model was locating things to make a garden, but had nothing to do about the construction of the house. It's all homogeneous glue in there. I had a very good Dutch contractor, and he plastered the entire thing. He was quite wonderful. Its major space is a 28-foot-high hall where the entry is there and the dining is there. The stairs and the living room is in the foreground, and the kitchen's at the end, facing south, etc. I won't go into it. That's finished, but it was far more interesting to me when it was concrete block in some and framing in others, and before it all got covered over in one articulated kind of surface through there. Years later, I look back at these things, and I think the house is far better at this point than what it was. Then I went to Houston, Texas, got involved in a number of larger competitions and projects, most of which didn't get built, but I figured it was new territory, and I had better get my act together. The Contemporary Arts Museum by Gunnar Burkitz, which I'm not showing you but exists there, believe me, as a parallelogram, okay, the trustees wanted to come up with what they called schemes and dreams, a plan for its expansion. They had a number of requirements. Number one, to double the exhibition space, which is this no man's land in between, non-architectural space. Number two, you could only do it where they had a front and back garden. So they said you have to come up with a new sculpture garden, which is what that program was. And they also needed some auditorium and some teaching facilities, which is what that is about. I basically expanded the building. I'm not going to explain it. My preoccupation, though, was to make a new territory, a garden, that the building became a new landscape in a city that was perfectly flat. Now, back in 81, 82, there were cranes building 24 hours a day in the city. The city was lit up as a city under construction all over the place. They had a bronze pyramid with a bronze palm tree, the only kind of palm that lives in Houston. I relocated it from the back and put it up in this landscape that was constantly rebuilding itself, that had a lower dimension, etc., and then there was a lower dimension through there. Okay. I straightened out the box. I established a route up to the grotto and to the new sculpture garden. It, I'm afraid, still looks like 1982 in the front. That was recognizable portals to get down to the basement. I'm sorry we had that. I should have stuck to my guns and made the facade of the building this garden that came on down. It had a new elevator. It had to be put in back there across the back. And that was the landscape from the top. Okay. About the same time, we worked on the Harvard Gate competition. I was concerned, since Houston was building itself, on Quincy Street, there was a competition to provide a gate. The cars went in, but you couldn't drive out, and I was already Houston-oriented, and I figured if you can't drive out, what kind of gate can it be? So I said, instead of putting a gate, I will block up the entry. So I built a blockage over there. It was something that would be under construction for a long time. It's an existing building, freshman dining hall here, a McKim meat and white gate over there. You can't see it all, except the fact is that it was the denial of gate. It also had the names of all the architects who built on the street: Corbusier, McKim meat and white, John Andrews, Sterling, etc. And as you went on up, the crane would add another level, and there would be a Waldman building, etc., as it went on. Anyway, it was a notion of building the unfinished, of inverting that would be normally there. That was back in, I guess, 82, 83. Christopher Gennick and I think back in 1984, I've lost track, started to do a number of urban design competitions. I think we may be better designers than readers, but the first thing Chris sent off for was the Times Square, what we call the Times Square competition. It's really, and it was a 200-page brief. We looked at it quickly, and we thought it was about the making of a public space, Times Square. We didn't realize until about 10 days later and 4 days before it was due that it was really about cladding the existing Times Square Tower building, which everybody else did. Anyway, we were among 8 of the first prize winners, specifically because they said we did not do another facade job on the building there, but we actually established a program for public use, for public space. We established a narrative, part derived from texts covering 5,000 years, part a narrative about how this site would be built over many lifetimes or many generations. I won't go into it at all step by step. It's probably worth it. But it was the notion that as one built on this site, that one would initially dig into the ground, into the subway system, into the foundations of the city, and instead of shipping the dirt over to Staten Island or New Jersey, you would keep it there. And with time, you would dig down and people would say, what's happening there? What kind of park or building would happen? And we projected that a sewers treatment plant be built to clean up the act of Times Square. And in the process of building this thing, hundreds and thousands of water chambers would be built that could be used for the homeless during the construction phase of this project that would go on for generation after generation through there. And then they would be filled up with gushy water that would be cleaned and would spill over on New Year's Eve, and everybody would splash around and get a bottle to take home. It's a longer narrative on that. I won't go into it, except it made, through a series of drawings and projections, the idea that if you spent enough time on the site, and the site indeed was trapezoidal, and we thought, or I thought by my training, that any public piazza or plaza or square had to be geometrically square. And how do you make a square out of a trapezoid? We found in the end that Times Square was indeed a circle because it had a temporal life, which went on like that. This theme kind of pursued a number of things we did. We did the University of Miami master plan. We set up a number of construction moves, which is first step, second step, third step, fourth step through here. It is a campus that is dominated by this wiggly thing in the middle. It was dominated by a man-made lake, Lake Osceola. It was muddy, it was grungy. The program brief said you have to do something with this eyesore there. It's a health hazard. They also said that two other conditions. They wanted a kind of landscape plan for the greening of the campus. They also said that all future buildings should be covered in coral veneer. They also said that a couple feet below the thin topsoil was coral beds. They said that there were fraternities here. They wanted to take down the apartments and build other residential college systems. They said there was a residential neighborhood to the north, and they wanted a new north-south center, among many things. What we projected, a lethal thing. Anyway, what we projected there is that one drained the lake, then one takes that mud, okay, and brings it to the top of the site by the residential neighborhood, makes it a nursery out of that. That with time you cut into the coral stone, you get the veneer that will cover all the buildings. That as you cut into that surface down into the ground, it becomes a student center. There's parking, there's all sorts of underground bazaars. The existing athletic fields become wrapped in a forest. There are residential colleges, each with their own narcissistic pool, so that each college can look, and students can look at themselves rather than having a university lake. The individuals can have their own lake. It's filled with a north-south center that reorganizes the campus. The fraternities themselves have their own kind of landscapes through there. Went for the master plan, and so the first thing was to dredge the lake, to establish a quarry, to establish a nursery to the north. The second thing was to establish the colleges, et cetera, various pieces around there. We wrote text for the commencement of classes, which started in hurricane season, where the whole campus would be awash in water, okay, and things students would do with that. We also wrote programs for graduation. For the first thing was matriculation to move in, and graduation or commencement at the end, where people would then gather around the north-south center, water would spray on up, everybody would get nice and wet, and they remembered 4 years ago when they started in hurricane season. Anyway, it became a structure, okay, for dealing with this campus, which had a temporal cycle from hurricane season to the campus drying out, the ground cracking, springtime, and the final wetting down, etc. Okay. Then during that time, we worked on the hurricane house, a house that was to be built upon old plantation foundations that was wiped out in the great hurricane of 1900 in Galveston, Texas. This is a map of Galveston Bay. It involved both the making of a house, which is that, to resist the hurricane, as well as a number of packing crates. The owner, who was a young geologist, was very much concerned that if a hurricane came along, he wanted a house that was strong enough, its primal structure, to use that word, to resist the hurricane, but pieces could and should blow off, because it is all right to rebuild after the hurricane. But when a hurricane was coming, it was extremely important to pack up one's telescope and one's microscope and one's geological rock samples and maybe even some wedding china, and pack them all together. And then he got engaged and married in the process, and his wife had a huge wardrobe to pack up as well. In any event, we wrote two narratives at two different times and then put them together. One of them was a narrative of the construction process between a mason and a framer, okay, of how to build the house to withstand a hurricane. The other one was how to build the packing crates. I won't go into them. Perhaps one should go into them, but I will show you some examples of both. Again, the modeling is the same. The property faced north onto Galveston Bay. There were some foundations left in the middle of the old plantation house. There was an old sugarcane grinding tool in the ground. There's a driveway that came along that flattened part, and there was a kind of dry gulch that filled in with rainwater in the back of the site to the south. An astronaut, because it's right near NASA, lives right to the south, became extremely important. Right here, a mason, a retired mason, lived to the east, which is over here. The mason came in before we got involved. There was a deteriorating edge, which you may see in one of the models, and he built the breakwater for the young geologist. The first architectural act then was to break the ground, to strengthen it, to make it geometric again, to square. He did such a good job on that. Our next strategy was that he would build this wall in the back. That wall would cast shadow and shade, which is so important in Houston, upon the site and give the owner privacy. Okay, then the owner, who was in the oil business, proceeded slowly, but he loved the site. He loved to see the stars. He loved to use microscopes and telescopes. So the idea was to build a $30,000 wall and then a $30,000 frame. And this frame went up to hold the new roof, okay, which were bowstring trusses, which were to be made in San Antonio. And they would provide a very strong structure between the two for a while, where he could come and visit on weekends between his oil trips. This is the finished plan. The south is over there. The water's edge is down here. One drives in this way, enters through a bridge, through a wall of machinery and storage. One's car comes in here. You encounter packing crates of an entry piece right through there. The kitchen is over here, which all the appliances pack up in case of a hurricane. There's a large living room space, 18 by 54, which is a fireplace, which is big enough to live in, and a dining room, which also packs up all the wedding china, etc., and a stair that is located both here, but also is like an airplane stair, moves around and can go up anywhere. So it's shown here, it's shown here. The front is a whole bunch of glass panels that open up, protected by the screen. It was okay for the glass to break. It was okay for certain out pieces to go. All these things are very fragile plywood pieces that stick out, but the back masonry wall and the front frame and the roof structure had to hold. It's a 3-level house. This is the upper level. You can see the packing crates that hold his and her wardrobes through there, and stairs that come up to observatories, etc. Never got built, unfortunately. It's very simple on the water side, which faced north. Okay. This is the eastern side with plywood, brise-soleils, and the little telescope room that he'd look out for the morning star through there, and the fireplace that went up on the outside of that glass box. The western side also had sun breaks. Kitchen looks out with not too glary a kind of condition and the kind of screening piece through there. He wanted very much to close up his house, to pull up his gate when the hurricane came, and when he was away. He wanted to make sure no one would get into his house, so the door became a real problem. And that's the water side and the western side. That's the eastern side. Okay, the western side again. Okay, and then we got to the making of the packing crate, the space-making devices within this larger piece through there. Okay, and as we were doing the hurricane house and trying to get it down to a smaller size to get it built, and the owner was very well intended, the AIA in 1988 asked 4 architects around the country to do a room for the National Convention in New York in May of 1988. We weren't getting anything built, and we got this nice small budget, and we figured, well, if we weren't going to get our whole house built, maybe we could do one packing crate well. The program of the packing crate was the following. It had to be within an 8-foot by 8-foot by 8-foot cube. It had to be built, unless you wanted to subsidize it, with a budget of $5,000. Its intention is that it would come from different parts of the country to New York City to be on exhibit for 3 months, then go out to Dallas in the fall of '88, over to Los Angeles, January of '89, up to Chicago, Atlanta, I think Mobile, Alabama, and has finally came back to Houston for the AA convention, National Convention, in May of 1990. It was to go to a number of cities. We decided that since this room had to go to a number of places, we had better take the packing crate into consideration, and we thought that as it went from Houston to New York, it would get some marks slapped on it, etc., and become a recording of where it had been, like people who put National Forest kind of stickers on their cars. And so we began to be obsessed with what this packing crate was like and felt that we had to reinvent the wheel. We started for many reasons, which I won't go into, but with 17 sheets of Baltic plywood. Okay, why Baltic? It was pure, it was tough, it was foreign, which is important. It was a stranger in a condition that would not be from New York and not be from Los Angeles and not be from Houston, but it was indeed foreign and nomadic. Okay, 16 pieces went into the making of the packing crate or the wheel. 1 went into the making of the room. We found out in the process that the packing crate was enough of a room unto itself. These are one of the starts of the sheets through there. And we start with certain simple measuring kind of techniques. And Chris Gennick, I, and Ed Wilson, who is an artist slash fabricator, we picked him because we had to collaborate with an artist on this. Todd Williams did it with Mary Miss. He's from Detroit, Michigan, but now he's considered a New Yorker. I'm supposedly from New York, but I'm considered a Texan. W.G. Clark was the only authentic one. He is from South Carolina. And the last one was Fred Fisher from Los Angeles. Anyway, we cut those 16 pieces into the making of a wheel, which we thought, since a packing crate had to be put on a dolly, maybe we could just make it into one big wheel. We cut a bunch of concentric circles and kept an eye on the leftover pieces. We then cut the leftover pieces into a 2-part cut to make a carriage that would sit inside of a wheel. We even took the leftover pieces and made wheels that the carriage sat on inside of the larger wheel. We found, besides wood, we went to using steel. We left the writing on the pieces that the shop had put on. This Ed Wilson connecting the carriage to the wheel, to the larger wheel. One of my menial tasks, since I'm not the world's greatest carpenter, was to keep this thing clean. And every day in the shop, it would get nicked up a little bit, banged up like down there. And I got some sandpaper, and I would go by obsessively and try to keep it clean. And on occasion, we took it out into the courtyard of the school there and wheeled it around and said, okay, this isn't even the room, it's the space or the garden or the wilderness within which the room will exist. And the last piece of plywood we saved for that room. Well, I should say that in the process of trying to keep it clean, and our enthusiasm of banging it around the place, it got dirty, Chris Gennick came up with the bright idea that perhaps we ought to scar the piece and that we ought to put it through some of the experiences as if to toughen it up when it goes up east, as we say in Texas. So we burnt it, he burnt it, and filed it, and stabbed it, and scored it, and toughened up the condition so it would be ready to withstand all those Yankees up there. And so its surface took on a kind of patina through it all. We gave 2 different surfaces. I was out there pushing turtle wax into kind of like Vaseline to make it feel better. And Chris and Ed were gouging at that. And I said, how can you do this? I really felt very pained in the process. But it did get toughened up, and I didn't have to sand it anymore. And then this piece, which was just burned and blistered, I was able to put turtle wax in and kind of be nice to it. And so we had this tough vehicle sitting there then. And we'll go to the next one. Thank you. I'm going to race now. We're ready for the next one. Okay. Shots of this tough vehicle. Okay. It even had some interior space that we learned to stabilize it. Became a room. We thought, isn't this enough? Just a thing that could roll into the back of a moving van, or if we had lots of time, we'd sort of pedal it to New York or what. And we pushed it around campus. It was good. But we finally got around to committing ourselves to the room. It has many names. We called it nomadic. We called it totemic. We called it testigo or witness. because it's the witness to these things. It was also pregnant. It had a life. It was like a casket for a new baby. It also was where it was the size of what you could be buried in as well. We figured people spend most of their time, whatever that is, in the kind of death condition, perhaps, so that maybe a significant room is the one that one spent a lot of time in. But it had 100 eyes and 100 legs like a centipede. It had a face. It was made out of all the leftover pieces that were left over, the little blades of pieces in the front. There, I think, 7 blades and 6 spaces. We actually put metal armor over the virgin wood where we didn't blister it. We kept it smooth. I had to sand it. But then on the outside, we put a kind of mild steel coating so that when we lifted it into the wheel and it could turn around like a gyroscope through there while the wheel was going in one direction, this went another. And we made it a time clock to set up for gallery hours. For about 8 hours a day, you could put sand in there, and it had a little stick, and it would hit the metal as it slid on up and would lose sand in there. So it became a very small room in this larger room or garden. It was made to develop into a number of contexts in each of the cities that it went. These are some of the 100 eyes that could keep an eye on what was happening in the back. It also had 100 little legs, so you could roll it across like a centipede on the floor and become like a baby's casket or something. It also had steel plates that were etched with navigational charts of Galveston Bay, so it could find its way home. So if it got lost in Los Angeles or Detroit or something like that, it's like a dog tag. People would say, "And where are you from?" They'll say, "Oh, Galveston Bay," and that seemed to be close enough to home for us. That, anyway, became a real model. The making of it became a model. The, hopefully, economy of the materials became a model of how other buildings might be built. Okay, and now I'm going to get into those other buildings with a vengeance. This is my friend the Sphinx again in the pyramid. The Princeton House, okay, is a combination of the known and the unknown. It's a reversal of the house itself. And I should say, it was for, well, we'll go into it a bit, and then I'll give you a little bit of reading quickly. It also is concerned with the Eric theme, okay, with what I call the pregnant column. Eric Coffine, who is one of the clients, Erica and her husband Bob, had just had 2 children, was expecting a third when I was engaged as architect. The baby was born a month after I started work on it all. So I knew her when she was full of life, and a few months later she got pregnant again, so now there's a 4th child, and the house still isn't finished. She was so forceful in wanting a Texas architect, okay, who happened to just get some things built in Houston, that she was the real life of it all, that I thought that she would be the dominant one there. And I gave her, which you'll see in the project, a kind of locational device of a pregnant column holding up the structure in the front. Okay, the story of a genesis of its building is true here. I'm also concerned, which you'll see about this building, of creating the world within the building, not projecting out of the building into the world. It's particularly important given the nature of the house. This, by Neutra, is about a house that outside slips into the building, inside slips on out. The overhanging roof, the slipping of the ground, is deliberately about the simultaneity of these conditions. Why it is important is that the existing house was done by an apprentice of Neutra, a man named Thaddeus Longstrath, done as the retirement house, and this is the existing one that I encountered, for the director of the Institute of Advanced Study in Princeton. It was what was called a small house of about 2,500 square feet. I thought it was a great house. It had overhanging roofs, it had glass and concrete block, and it seemed too small for these clients who had moved 7 times in about 15 years of marriage. And they loved moving in, making something bigger, and then moving on. So these people had things always packed up, but liked the challenge of going from one house to the other. Okay. And so what I'd like to get into very briefly is this condition. Wonderful. In terms of cultural intervention about how do you do houses for the homeless Americans who pay high mortgages. It's by Walter Lippmann. It's called Barren Ground. Okay? He said in 1927, the American people, more than any other people, is composed of individuals who have lost association with old landmarks. They have crossed an ocean. They have spread themselves across a new continent. The American who still lives in his grandfather's house feels almost as if he were living in a museum. There are few Americans who have not moved at least once since their childhood, and even if they have stayed where they were born, the old landmarks themselves have been carried away to make room for progress. That perhaps is one reason why we have so much more Americanism than love of America. It takes time to learn to love the new gas station which stands where the wild honeysuckle grew. Moreover, the great majority of Americans have risen in the world. They have moved out of their class, lifting the old folks along with them perhaps, so that together they may sit by steam pipes and listen to the crooning of the radio. But more and more of them have moved not only out of their class, but out of their culture. And then they leave the old folks behind, and the continuity of life is broken. For faith grows well only as it is passed on from parents to their children amidst surroundings that bear witness, because nothing changes radically to a deep permanence in the order of the world. It is true, no doubt, that in this great physical and psychic migration, some of the old household gods, extremely important, are carefully packed up and put with the rest of the luggage, and then unpacked and set up on new altars in new places. But what can be taken along is at best no more than the tree which is above the ground. The roots remain in the soil where first they grew. The sidewalks of a city would be, in any case, be a stony soil in which to transplant religion. Throughout history, as Spangler points out, the large city has bred heresies, new cults, and religion. Now, when we speak of modern civilization, we mean a civilization dominated by the culture of the great metropolitan centers. Our own civilization, America, is perhaps the most completely urbanized of all, for even the American farmers, though they live in the country, tend to be suburban rather than rural. I am aware of how dominating a role the population outside the great cities play in American life, yet it is in the large cities that the temple of our civilization is determined, and the tendency of mechanical inventions as well as economic policies to create an irresistible suction of the country towards the city. The deep and abiding traditions of religion belong to the countryside, for it is there that man earns his daily bread by submitting to superhuman forces whose behavior he can only partially control. There is not, like the sun and the moon and hurricanes, there is not much he can do when he has plowed the ground and planted his seed except to wait hopefully for sun and rain from the sky. He is obviously part of a scheme that is greater than himself, subject to elements that transcend his powers and surpass his understanding. The city is an asset that dissolves this piety. How different it is from an ancient vineyard where men cultivate what their fathers have planted. In the modern city, it is not easy to maintain that reverent attachment to the sources of his being and the steadying of his life by that attachment. It is not natural to form reverent attachments to an aperture attachments to an apartment on a 2-year lease, an imitation mahogany desk on the 32nd floor of an office building. In such an environment, piety becomes absurd. But for the facetious and the pious man looks like a picturesque yokel or a stuffy fool. Yet without piety, without a patriotism of family and place, without an almost plant-like implication in unchangeable surroundings, there could be no disposition to believe in the external order of things. Okay, the omnipotence of God means something to men who submit daily to the cycles of the weather and the mysterious power of nature. Okay, enough of that stuff. However, it's very much that program at core about how these models of how do you build on a 10-acre site, heavily wooded. These are the foundations of the existing house. It has a concrete slab for a garage and a road up there. It has a full basement. It has a partial crawl space. There was a territory to the south. I should say that these people wanted to double their house, put a new kitchen, breakfast room, dining room, living room, screen porch, master bedroom, bathroom. They also felt with 10 acres they had no place to go. They had no garden. Deer came and ate all their plants. The children had no flat land to grow on. And more than anything else, with the long overhangs and the windows primarily to the north, which is down here, east is here, west is there, south is there, that no direct light ever entered their house. They wanted a house that had morning and afternoon light. So what I did is I found that the house had a 16 by 12 foot bay variation, and I extended that logic to the outside and like surveying the site, put strings out there. And then I thought to make a garden, one could establish a number of retaining walls and a number of parterres or landscapes. And I dug foundations that would make the garden. There was a stone parterre and a grass parterre and a grotto or sunken parterre, and then what would be a flower parterre through there. And the retaining walls of the gardens became the structural foundations of the house through there. And the new house was a big warehouse to the east and a sunken room for the master bedroom. I mean, to the east, I'm sorry, and this is to the west through there. I then put in the 2x12 framing, which I don't know if you can see through there, and the single structural column through there. And I did this as much to show the contractors to develop a logic for myself. In this house, we didn't have to cut a single concrete block or a single piece of wood, which is very different from contractors who used to tell me 10, 15 years ago I knew how to torture materials. Anyway, we then located existing and new objects, bathrooms, fireplaces, etc., in the old house, plus a new one and a new fireplace and new water objects out here, sitting on that plywood floor, okay? We then brought up the retaining walls, again, these masonry walls through here, and put the walls in the existing house. Then we put the roof framing on, again, each 2x12, one after the time. And then we put the roof on, and this is the box. I should say that where the house has overhangs, the new house has not a single inch of overhang. It does the reverse. It turns the house inside in. The overhangs turn into onto yourselves, which are those fins and light fins, etc. It has a nomadic room at the end, which is now the screen porch, and that to save money, this is no longer the great room. We made it back in the house, and the screen porch is no longer there. This garden is a bit different. But what stood out is this becomes the Sphinx and the pyramid. The new courtyard is made as a level ground so the deer can't get in to eat what grows there. And there's a landscape established to the east where you can look out on a glass wall from this new wing and see a landscape that was not there before. Okay, and the very last thing that makes this different from the others is that there is a stair that comes out that swings around 180 degrees, which to my delight that they have built, and I'll show you it there as well. This is the plan. The original house has a driveway coming down and the garage. It has guests walking here, living room, study, bedrooms, kitchen here, laundry room, what was a dining room. That's that house I just showed you. Right through here, we basically added a new entry slot, a kitchen, breakfast room, dining room, a patio, which is the start of a grotto sequence, and a new screen porch here, and master bedroom, bathroom sequence across this parterre there. Did some other things. But it's got incessant measure from 8 inches to 16 inches to 8 foot on centers throughout the entire house. There's everything works off of 16 inches, and it's multiples through there. I showed you the ground plan. This happens to be the ceiling plan with a number of moons going across the master bedroom, a number of lighting devices, a moon in the dining room, and a number of other light filtering devices that occur in those rooms. So the sky and the ground became two territories within which the project was held. This is what the deer see from the back from the woods. They see a concrete block wall. They see this nomadic tent that looks out there, and they see a project that looks east and west, and what has gotten much better in construction than it was when we did these design drawings over on that side. This is a view from the western side. It's basically a warehouse with some packing crates in here, glass block facing west. It's the garage over there, the screen porch here, the plinth, the new ground developing over there. This piece is made by a mason, glass block and concrete block. This is made by a framer, a wood framer. There's some steel in the projects as well. This is a viewer section which shows the moon and various lighting devices through there. That's a view of the pregnant column out front, my caryatid, where Erica Fine would look out at her children who she insists play on the driveway even though they have 10 acres of ground because the dirt will get them muddy. So they play in the southern front of the house. These are views of the packing crates in the kitchen, a packing crate in the breakfast room to hide the TV that they watch when they eat their meals, and the packing crate china closet in the dining room through there. View through that courtyard and through the grotto to the sunken master bedroom, which has a sextant so you can keep track of where you are at night. The moon shines through in various ways, and what had been the screen porch is now a simpler condition through there. A view looking through the courtyard in the other direction into between the dining room and the screen porch is another patio. And a view of the glassed, metered courtyard facing, in this case, east. It picks up the same meter as the glass on the original Longstrath house. And a view facing east, I guess it is the other side of that courtyard, which is the sunken landscape, which is now a stegosaurus and a pyramid, and two kinds of windows that look at the space beyond. Okay, that's it together. So there's a glass wall, there's a solid stone wall, block wall. It has a window looking here and has a blind window, the glass block looking west in that direction. Okay, it's a model of the packing crates. The dining room does get a few little night skylights to look for the North Star and pieces like that to keep the moon company. That's the upside down of the model, where there are light filters that come out of packing crates that filter morning light that comes into a high clerestory window and late afternoon light through the glass block. Two types of soffits in the breakfast room, one for afternoon light that punches through a hole, one for morning light that is filtered through these 16-inch on-center fins, and then the dining room through here with its moon. Another shot of what it might be, so we conjectured at night. And then I was there this weekend, and this case of building does look like its model. It's night through there. This is the dining room packing crate. There is a mini landscape, a world made again on a little eating terrace off the breakfast porch. And I should say that a number of fabrications were done on this job. Their clients are terrific, but I just knew that I didn't even want them to bid all the kind of funny steel work or magical boxes and moons and things like that, because I'd never get it built. But Greg Snyder is a former graduate student, and he fabricated them all in Houston in his little shop without air conditioning, which is a feat, and brought it up in a huge moving van, 28 feet long, in July, and installed it, and is back there this past weekend doing some other things, etc. So there are, together with the house being built by rational scientists, etc., there's a magician at work. This is the frontal view of the caryatid and the windows coming through. This is a night view of the real thing. You can see these big eyes, or substitute mother for the kids. And that's the model of what that Sphinx and the pyramid will look like. It will light up at night with those brackets that aren't on there yet, but will be. That's the front of the Sphinx. There's, in the clear story, there's afternoon light coming in at one end and morning light at the other. One of the little kids, when we started construction, we started at what was a garden wall next to the existing kitchen, which then got ripped out and became one very large room when we got done. And that kept us, this Sphinx-like piece, this animistic piece that started to cut the ground, stayed on the site for about 6 months. And I thought it would disappear out the first week, but it stayed there. It will show up in various pictures. When we laid out the strings and put the barge boards there, we reused the concrete stained barge boards for the foundations for the roof of the nomadic tent later on. So you see like that, they're stained with concrete, they've been used on the job, they've got real dirt there, and they're used again to make the sky. Okay, slightly upside down. Okay, 1 week into construction, this is the first of the retaining walls in the beginning of the master bedroom box that's set in the ground. I like the little kids and the machines all huddled around. This, when we got to, I became conscious of how things were built. When I built some things out of stone and some things out of wood, and they remained that way. Even the pyramid, they weren't sure about what I had intended, so we blocked it up there, and I was happy that it got just tacked up there for a little while out of that wood kind of set of regulating hidden lines through there. And my friend, the surrogate Sphinx or something, this kind of beastie is there, which is helping to build it, and then one of the retaining walls. Okay. The project probably looks best before it got finished, but it was very clear that there were a number of concrete block walls and very clear that there was a kind of number of packing crates and a framing piece. They were all separate from one another at a time. They all sat on their own kind of logics. And that's the nomadic tent on the other side, beginning to form out the space through here where those barge boards of the floor were used. And just like the model, the 2x12s come racing across. And it still probably looks better now than it does when it's finished. This is the beginning of the packing crate that then other things came up in the truck that went against that wall. I wish the whole thing came, but it made sense to build that one stud wall and then bring the stuff on the inside. That's the space between the patio and the warehouse box. Okay. And the relocated heater. And that framing, which goes through a number of qualifying measuring, 16 inches comes up all the time, measuring qualities through there that then begins to get sheathed in. This is the concrete stained wood through there. It loses something as it goes on. It seemed quite good when it was halfway in between. Then it got tamed and painted, okay, and the screen isn't in yet, but the framing is through there. And then the screen goes on, which flattens out the surface incredibly, so it takes on all these realities. This is part of the head of this kind of nomadic bird that starts flying back into the house, which you'll see soon. Wintertime last year, and then the wood starts getting painted, which kills it. And these concrete piers, block piers, are still there in the hallway. That gets qualified and becomes a pink cloud. And then some of my excessiveness comes across in a number of points. For a garden that will never really be planted the way it could have been, there are remnants of parterres that occur at certain locations, which you might see later. This should have come before. It's when it was the wooden ceiling, which has its own measure, its own logic, that then gets transformed as that painted glow. You can see the two sides of the courtyard at once, both the glass measuring side and a piece of that garden that isn't really there, and the view across to this garden, not made of glass, but made of wall. The clear story, originally was all glass, but to save money, we have a few pockets, which I think are a lot better. The warehouse lets in eastern light. More kids, okay, and Greg Snyder installing the head of the Stegosaurus, the Sphinx, over there, of the master bathroom. That's the front, which is both block to match the house, as well as the abstracted panels to make it into a facade, okay, which occurs at a certain point, and then the beginnings of this territory, this garden that is pulled out and through the space where you eat on the outside over there. They actually abandoned the kids there with the grown-ups eat in the courtyard. Scott Bernhard, who helped Greg Snyder make the pregnant column and a lot of the pieces, on site there, kind of grinding it down for the last time. You can see the pregnant column. You can see some of the devices that hold up the ceiling fins, and this is the stair that swivels 180 degrees through there. This is another stair that goes onto that porch, which I'll show you. It's Greg putting them together on the porch. These are clearly additive pieces made out of steel, another kind of measure. So there's what will be a wood-topped eating table, a little place for the little child to look out and survey who's coming down the driveway. It's also obviously a shelf, a place for, I think we're going to the next. We'll be done in no time, he said. In one project after this. These are the latest shots of last Saturday. It's the box with some of the pieces in place, shot early in the morning, I think, moving around. That stair in place, it's getting pretty dense through there. That other stair, there's one other piece, a trellis that comes across the top. If you don't think it has enough, it's going to be really, given the mason, all the other things now have a chance to go and operate onto that one space as articulated pieces. Okay. obviously like that spot. This is the screen porch, which gets that stair that swivels, which isn't in place there. Interesting thing is when we put another stair there, it's like burying the first family child. We dug a foundation and the stair had to sit in a little space. We put sand over it to make the ground a little bit more holy at that spot. This is the existing house with its overhang. The new one has no overhang, as you've noticed. You can hardly see the stegosaurus. It's pretty subtle through there. And this is the beginning of a step that goes from one side to the other. Greg putting that step in, it flips up and stands up to block the view. When they don't want the kids to get on down, it flips up into space. But it has its own meter and makes its own altar through there. Okay, that's the stegosaurus. We decided not to put copper on it, which made it opaque, but to leave the measuring lines in it. So it's a bit more subtle, but I think it works in the place. It's going to get a blue eye, though. All-American eye, right through there, so that will swivel in the wind, and we'll get still these fins and these lights. The whole thing will light up at night. You'll see it from across the courtyard. This becomes another packing crate for family photographs on a stair that goes down to the master bedroom. This other thing is an absent packing crate. It was supposed to be there. They thought it blocked a view, and now we're going to put some swivel visor in it. That's the Sphinx in the pyramid. One of the parterre terraces looking through that space. You can see some of the layers that go through there, and a bit of the garden that isn't here is there. It's a bit more of that garden. And one of the packing crates holding kitchen appliances. More kitchen appliances, and tile that measures everything. This is an interesting sequence. I'm almost done on this warehouse Princeton thing, where we measure out the ceiling off of the 16-inch on center core wall skylight grid. Between the clear story and a skylight, we establish these light fins for the early morning light and for the glass block light. And quickly they measure out, all four of them, in the space. We attach one fin out of 3/4-inch plywood after the other. They begin to make a space. They also will be getting All-American and not so All-American eyes. They get suns and moons that go in some of the spaces, so there'll be satellites that reflect light off of this. There's a light track that isn't here, but you'll see it soon, bringing light to the island in the middle of the kitchen. Down there, that's the light track, and it's a light track at night without lights on it yet. That in the breakfast room is the beginning of closing in this space, which then has a western-facing light that comes on through, and eastern light gets buffeted by those pieces through there. Putting them up, looking to the dining room, where the moon is not in place yet, but these things are beginning to go one after the other. Also making a space at that point, making a space through there, place for the television. More of those fins that are going to the movies, more of that stair which acts like an altar, which is another kind of issue that will happen, and that's the 16 acres of woods that they have in the back. Within the making of this warehouse are a number of precious objects. One of them is a makeup center for Erica Fine, who's very young and doesn't need it, but she has a lot of makeup, and it is a device that works in the master bathroom. It's shot next to the lawnmower, which is a fascination for Greg Snyder. But it's an animistic piece itself, maybe somewhat Sphinx-like. It holds, like a whale, perfume, which comes from whale spit or something like that. And it's got its own feet, and it's got these little legs that go across, but it's the tiled floor, which you'll see. It's got copper, and you see it in the bathroom turned on up, but it looks like a shmoo or a shamu or a whale or something. And it's being carted into... Again, it has an ingenious number of drawers to put expensive perfume and other things. This also is next to it. It's the Hamper, another kind of important packing crate where you put your dirty clothing that still has the smell of your body in, together with shaving cream and other kinds of things through there. That is next to the whale spit. So the two of them go together into this bathroom, and the makeup thing wheels out so you can get access to all that good stuff. More of that stuff. It's Sphinx-like in a way to me. It's animistic. Okay. Beginning of the Trojan Horse, which I call the stable. This is a preface for a house in a terrible subdivision in Houston, full of houses $500,000 and up. They built it in 1 year. The Friends were Development Corporation. It's economic segregation. They built 2,500 houses. Most of them are in 12 acceptable house styles. 2 of them are done by Rice University faculty. One is Frank Lloyd Wrightian, which is almost acceptable, and I call mine Texas traditional, which is not one of their acceptable. In Texas, you can build Georgian and Norman and Monterey style and old hacienda style, anything but Texas. When I came to present to the board, they asked, what kind of style was this? Anyway, they wanted its name, and I said it's a Texas traditional from the hill country. It's really just a barn of a house, but it holds a very strange object. I was interested, since I was not wild about the conventions of the stuff there, what could I do to find some territory to gain access to an architectural program for the house? And I thought of the Trojan Horse. It came after the fact. I didn't know how to handle the stair. I didn't know how to handle yet a third study they suddenly wanted for the 2 of them to come together. I didn't know how to handle an extra little observatory or screen porch that they wanted all at once. So I said, this thing is not going to fit. So I said, if it's not going to fit, let's ram it through the house. And it looked like a horse. So I'm curious about this kind of horse that the Greeks made, who came strangers from some other place, and they headed towards Troy, and eventually Armenia, I would hope, in any event, and they made some invention that came into the walls, these old visions. And when Troy went down, Aeneas left with his father and took a long journey by way of Carthage, etc., to found the city of Rome. So it seemed that there was something about the foreignness of this Trojan horse, this thing you couldn't name, that forced you to go from one place to the other. Quick stage sets for Bizet's Ballet of the Trojans, okay, which I think are remarkable landscapes, this tilted plain, this city of walls, this kind of fire city under attack, this kind of the threat of people coming and the ocean, or the Greek Ocean kind of sea threatening the place, the threat of wilderness at one edge, the calming because they thought that the Greeks had gone away, the city wall, which seems pretty much intact, some leaks over that wall, some hints that something are happening. They thought the Greeks left, but they really came on back, just pushing of these things into it, the kind of breaking down the walls, the kind of smell of death, and finally the Trojan horse comes in and breaks through the whole kind of space. This is examples. This is a golf course in Houston, Texas, in February last year when the project began construction. These wonderful houses are of the 12 acceptable house styles, are neighbors. The site faces north to the golf course. And the reason why the Trojan horse is of interest to me, and this was the first preliminary concept, is everybody assumed the golf course would be the view. And most houses down there, if you had a golf course site, filled up the back or the side with garages and debris. I thought that the house needed some other view than the one that they had, other than the green one. So I got the commission because I proposed them another landscape, okay? And basically it built a very simple barn of a house, which had to have a pediment, and there was some water functions in the back. And it was on a cul-de-sac, which you'll see, so I said, look, we've got to react to that. So I accommodated that. This is west, south, this is north, south light came here, morning light came in here, and afternoon light came in there. The concept held, this is the final scheme that was built. It was this Texas traditional, rammed through with what I call the Trojan horse. It's like a decapitated horse, which is the stair. Its head is pushed over here as if it's yanked through the house, and the rib cage is right in the middle. It has 2 garden walls, one which is the master bedroom. They got very selfish about the space it needed. Looking into the courtyard, the swimming pool is in the back, a great big, what is a fan here to ventilate the site is now a 13-foot high wall right above the pool to enclose the space. The maid has her own wing. In American culture, I find that maybe the maid is the one who really uses the house all the time. She lives in, these people work all the time, come home at night when they leave before the sun is up and they come home when it's down. She really gets the best deal. You'll see that her house, only 8 feet wide, is equivalent to the master study. In fact, you can't tell who the maid or the master is. There's a garage in between. You can see the concept of the Trojan horse pushing through the space very far from all the rest of the stuff. There's two-story space behind it. These big chess pieces are what I call witnesses. There's a big, ugly two-story house in the back. There are ugly two-story houses all over. To make the courtyard private, I thought you'd have to, over a one-story wing, protect it with something. It also casts various shadows in the morning and gets light in the afternoon. It's part of this is the view now, which is important to realize when you see the ugly house next door. We're getting a garden wall as tall as this one-story wing across here with 4 fans, not just one fan to blow into it. This was old oil property owned by Exxon. When the oil gave out, they turned it into ersatz communities. And this, I envision the ground cracks a lot there because the water table's been pumped out. Terrible gumbo clay. I had visions like in Fantasia that great dinosaurs died there, left its kind of marks, and would kind of get disturbed when it found out a Trojan horse had come over from Armenia to take a look at it. So it's a stable for the Trojan horse and a Stegosaurus. What happens is that there is this wall, garden wall, for the cul-de-sac cars pull in here. They encounter facade through here. They go through the garden wall. You have to remember, because they've only built this much, they're going to build that soon. Through this trellis, look out at the expensive golf course site and say, boy, the Wedges have lots of cash. Then turn and go into the other front. This house has many fronts. There's a front to the normative neighborhood filled with pediments. They forced me to put this pediment in the front. The one thing at a flat-top garage, and they said it looked strange. In fact, they said it was obnoxious. They said they were like the rest of the house, but the garage looked like a garage. They said it was. And they said, well, make it look like a house. And I said, you mean a pediment? And they said, you're right, kid. So I put one on, anything to get through that board, because I showed them this model. I couldn't believe they bought this stuff. But they said they didn't care what people did in their private space, just as long as it looked acceptable on the front. So I gave it to them. That, anyway, is the maid and the master. Okay, the garage, the fragment for the cul-de-sac. That's her queen piece over there. That's her jacuzzi. That's his shower. That's their study in between. Her exercise room in the back. His study room in the front. Their joint room with matching computers to either side. You come in, you go under this overhang, and the entry is not frontal but lateral. You'll see this, but you come in underneath the belly of the horse, which is going to have one of these umbilical strings through it, and you come between the living room to your left and your dining room to the right. The kitchen is above his study there, which is off the garage, which works in that way. There's a media room in the back, which is an extension of the living room, on your way to the master bedroom and all that garbage over there. I think we have switched to the last, which will go real fast, I hope, be out of here in 7 minutes. Keeping you long. The last tray. The front, the maid and the master. The entry piece right here, laundry. It doesn't have the strategy of construction like the other one does. Unfortunately, I thought it had to be brick veneer to begin with to pass in the neighborhood. Only at the end did we do it. But to make life very simple, the cul-de-sac is here. The garage is pulled in here. There's a 6-foot wide walkway that goes down. If you're a guest, you come in here, you find an entry. There's an outhouse or powder room. You go through a thick wall. One big room, which is fireplace, media room, living room, underbelly, entry, dining room, kitchen, breakfast room, utility room up to maid, courtyard, Stegosaurus, and Trojan horse, which is the stair going up. Master bedroom is off the media room, closets, and bathroom stuff. And the second floor has, you come up the stair here, joint study, dual computer rooms, his study, her exercise room and bathroom. We've, thank goodness, got rid of that stair. There's a round room I call the room with a crown of thorns on it, which tortures and makes nightmares for the master bedroom below. It's an extra closet. She needed to put her furs in there, so I put great spikes into it just to pain her a little bit. There's the maid is up there. She gets the best view of the whole place. She has her own little balcony. That's the section through there, and this is the courtyard. There's a fish pond, which is his program, not mine, but it gives me another small beast to deal with. Okay, the neighborhood, that's the house. As of 2 days ago, at the end of the street, that's what we began with. Its foundation. It floods around there, so we built 3 feet off the ground. This becomes the place of the entry and the outhouse and the golf course on that side. This is on a very strict module of 16 inches, 4 feet, 8 feet, etc. There's another module which is harder to measure, which is the thing that comes from the Stegosaurus. And there is a third piece, the foundation of the Trojan Horse, is the fish pond itself, which has its own kind of logic and connects the two, coming off the middle line of the house. There's a number of machines at work. The Trojan Horse is being brought in steel by something foreign, a huge crane that is brought in steel for steel on its own kind of span after the stud work is being done. It was lifted up there as a face over the maid's room, and then set in place. You can see why we're putting a 13-foot high wall next to the neighbors. It then gets located, that's the part of the cabana, and the maid will be above that in here, sitting on its own base, getting eventually there 3 steel interventions, one for the breakfast room in the far, I guess, west corner, and the diagonal east corner is her jacuzzi space, which is here, and the Trojan Horse is between the two. Then the same crane is brought in to bring in the roof, which has its own kind of logical module. They put it up in 45 minutes, end bays and all the other bays get brought up the top. The pieces are strung out curiously on the ground and then lifted into place on its own module. This is the golf course side, getting its roof sitting in place and then sitting into steel connectors that will stay exposed. Half the roof, it will be explicitly open frame, the other half gets post shade for the air conditioning equipment. Golf course side. Okay, the normative view, which is French doors, but the idea that people like to look at golf courses. Every room, the dining room, all the media room, dining room, living room, kitchen, they all get views in the center out there. But on the other side of the room, which you won't see, but see in the moment, there's a post denying the middle view, and you have to see the courtyard view from the denied center. The maid getting ready to be stuccoed, and the master being tarred and feathered over there. This becomes the head of the Trojan Horse, which it's a lot more pieces and a whole bunch of eyes. This is the maid's porch, looking out east past the pool into the jacuzzi area where we are. One of our friendly neighbors across the way. That is the jacuzzi room before its glass block, which gets morning light as well as afternoon glass block through here. That becomes his shower room, which also, like the chess pieces, keep watch in the place. More work on that piece. Then the bracing legs, or the kind of the chest pieces of the Trojan Horse are brought in another time. They're brought in across the roof this time and set one at a time. I wish I only did one instead of two, but anyway, they hold the stairs that are made out of steel and glass block, etc., over the fish pond there. And that's one side going in, fitting into place, and then another one across this territory. You can see the breakfast room has 2 eyes facing west for late afternoon light, as well as a picture window facing east that gets baseball caps, visors, to cut out the sun in 3 different locations. This is looking from the house past where the stair will be, and why, again, we need this wall going across at that height. That is the stair coming into, that's got a copper roof and 4 moons in it. Okay. More fins, which are like little carryouts coming up the stairs, which will be ebonized plywood and very dark and narrow, coming up to a certain point, and then it opens up into all that light. You can see the moon skylight there, but that these holes move around from west to east all day long, and hopefully have good company at night as well. This is that mutual room for the two looking down. It will have ribbed walls and be all plywood like a packing crate getting together. The library is in another packing crate filled with bookshelves that swivel on out. So we're looking towards the courtyard here in the other direction. Well, this is their new first storage room, which has its own crown of thorns over there, right above. The dead animals are hanging right above where the master bed is. While it was under construction, they said they realized there was no place to put the furs. I said, try a vault. They said they wanted to keep them at home, and I didn't want to start filling in any space, so I said there's room above your bedroom, and it would be good for the insulation, so the furs take the heat, and they give off whatever animal odors they do to the bed above. These two eyes are from the Trojan Horse. They've been pulled out, and you'll see where they're relocated into the middle of that room. This is for the bookcase through here. Okay, those are the eyes that bring southern light. We try to keep it away into this inside room that gets no real light at all. You can see some moons on the floor. Okay, more moons. And this is looking out to what will be the observatory or screen porch of the golf course, straight through this mutual room with the two computers to either side. Okay, you can see down here, caryatid, there's 8 of them that look or witness, have eyes looking into the space. They also hold hurricane shutters, and they're huge 10-foot by 10-foot sliding glass door panels. This is from the media room looking through where the two-way fireplace will be back to the kitchen, through the living room entry, dining room space, and you can see the underside, which will remain exposed of the mutual packing crate, and half the ceiling is remaining open and half will be filled in for the transportation of air ducts. You can see it beginning to be stuccoed now, and the caryatids, which keep witness in this space. She's also a very forceful client, so I thought, though she's beyond childbearing years, she could at least watch the space in some way different from the columns that will remain exposed. These are just plywood covers of something that are pretty heavily timbered through the space. That's the denied view opposite the French doors on the other side, so every room gets a column in the middle and French doors to the other side. View from kitchen through, and you can see some more of the rhythm of these caryatids, which actually go in the back of the media room as well. The house has very little sheetrock. It has a lot of plywood finishing the inside. It's going to have a terrazzo floor going from outside to outside again, all ending up in the black pool. It's a dark green terrazzo. This is I think it's an only 4-foot wide corridor to bypass the rooms coming in from the garage to the kitchen on your left, the breakfast room on your right, dining room, entry stair that goes out to the courtyard, living room, media room, master bedroom. There's an air conditioning duct that is exposed and does strange things through there. This is that same space on that side. And that's the piece of the Trojan Horse now beginning to get its balcony. There's some curved things that come up and act as reins for it all. And there is a kind of nose and bridle piece that goes between the two over there. Almost done, he said. Whale or horse meets maid, okay, meets him taking a shower, and she has a good view through his windows down to the master showering. He loves to sing to people in the pool. And that's his balcony, not mine. This is where the wall is going up along the edge of the pool. That's her glass block. You see the terrible houses that are around the whole place. That's the crown of thorns above the master bedroom. Over there, the dead animal room. So these things are pretty aggressive in there. It's like no other space. It's almost like Eberly. Christ stopped at Eberly, which I may or may not decide to read a brief paragraph to you. But the horse is still not finished, but it's coming along. Then we wanted to see what you could see from a distance, and there are only 4 more shots. And I guess I should bomb this or set fire to this house so I can take a picture of it. The maid is here. The maid's bathroom and cabana is there. She's only 8 feet wide. That's the stable of a house. It's very, very simple. There's the back wall, which goes on its angle because the property goes on an angle there. And I wedged it out as far as I could so I could get all the hanging closet stuff that they needed, and the stegosaurus in between. You can see everybody puts garages, though, in the backs of their property. I always thought that would take a lot of space. There's a kind of little corner of that world. It needs distance, I'm afraid, which it does not have. This is right next to it, but again, the garden wall comes straight across the roof height of this. So the Trojan Horse can look out to the landscapes of these pyramids and not the Sphinxes, but when you're in the courtyard, you be able to see it. Those are the 2 eyes that have got ripped out. A little bit more of that court. There's a nice spot for planting an orchard over here in the back of the house, the eastern side. That's the last one of the house, the crown of thorns. And I guess this is the normative front, which is a bit of an embarrassment, but it's supposed to look as if it's meant to be in part of that world. These are the last three cartographers. If I started with the map, I was concerned with David's death of Marat, who was a French revolutionist, who leaves a stone, like a tombstone, and he leaves a tentative thin paper message. There's a text at work in all these things, a kind of specifications for a new revolutionary society in his terms, but after he's murdered in the bathtub, all that's really left is this thin piece of paper and this thick piece of architecture. I would call him a surveyor in that he leaves marks. Okay, I would call Eng's painting of Raphael painting the Foreigner to be nomadic. Raphael did this painting in the 16th century. It's now 1825, and Eng is showing that Raphael is painting this supposedly lady again. However, the painting's here, but we know the painting's there. So there's a recurrency of what a nomad does in terms of building or repainting or re-representing again and again the same kind of preoccupation. And I think it's important that there's a city at work there at the same time. The very last shot is of Caravaggio's Narcissus, who's the lunatic, who makes a world unto himself. We don't know how deep or how shallow this happens to be. It's a world of real flesh and of costume, of real weight on this one hand, and you don't know if it's touching water or it's carrying weight down there. There are all sorts of structural notions in it. I think more than anything else, the Raphael painting, the Foreigner, has a temporal kind of issue. This is a temporal thing of a person seeing himself and duplicating himself. And the death of Marat is temporal in terms of it's the end of a revolution, an end of a kind of period, the end of his life. There is in the work of all these spatial tales of origin, I think, as much it is about construction, it's also about time. And I thank you for your time. That's it. I'm sure you're thirsty, but I'll either answer general questions or meet you around if you wish. Okay. Long. Almost 2 hours, I guess. Anyway, better give this guy one.